Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my basement, the portion of my basement, this corner here, that I refer to as my wormery. And the wormery, as you can imagine, based on its name, has worms living in it. That's right, worms, not just for the sake of having worms, but these worms are special types of worms. There's a few breeds of worms that are ideally suited for breaking down compostable materials. And a lot of people do partake in this hobby or pastime or whatever you want to call it, of recycling all your household kitchen scraps, all kinds of different materials, and rather than throwing them in the trash, giving them to worms. And there's a pretty nice side effect of that, or byproduct, which is that the worms, their manure basically, has kind of a nice name to it. They call it worm castings, or vermicastings, or vermicompost. And it's stuff that your plants love. It's really, really good, rich material. It's got a nickname of black gold, for that matter, in the gardening community. And if you look behind me here, all of these tubs that you see on the shelf, and then over this way as well, all of these tubs have composting worms living in them. And as you can imagine, they've all got to be fed. So the nice thing about that is that you don't have to go to the pet store and buy a bunch of Purina whatever to feed them. You can give them kitchen scraps, you can give them your spent coffee, you can even, shred your newspaper in Amazon boxes to feed them. They'll eat all that stuff and break it down and make beautiful castings for you. And the bins that I have on the docket today to get fed are a couple of bins right down here. They've got the European nightcrawler type of worm living in them. That's my abbreviation that you see on the boxes, ENC. And these bins were last fed 11 days ago. Even before that last feeding, 11 days prior, there was another feeding. So 11-day interval seems to be becoming the norm for these bins, just by coincidence actually, because it just sort of varies, on what I've got laying around the house. And what I got laying around the house right now that requires composting is a couple days worth of coffee. In fact, I've got this carton here. It's a carton that's almost full, and that's telling me I got to get rid of it, and it's going to the worms. So it's a little bit mundane because these poor worms actually received the same exact feeding last time, which was a couple banana peels and coffee. It's what they're getting again today. But they don't care. They'll eat it anyway. All right, I'm going to put on a glove, get the bins up on the bench, and we're going to get these guys fed. So let's get to work. Now, a little something I like to do sometimes in my worm bins is to informally celebrate milestone points in time, and we sort of let one come and go when it comes to these two bins. These two bins were both launched on the same day, 204 days ago, so their 200th day in service sort of came and went. We did sort of 2 feedings ago though, so it was 11 days to the previous feeding and then another 11 days to the previous feeding. It was exactly 22 days ago that the systems actually reached a milestone date as well, which was 6 months in service. So even though the 200th day mark sort of came and went without any fanfare, we did sort of make a little bit of a big deal out of the 6-month mark by giving them a really yummy feeding of all kinds of wide variety of veggies and all kinds of yummy foods. So when we came in here last time with just coffee and 1 banana peel, we did find the worms kind of mobbing around the middle area where they last got fed. So that coffee filter that you saw me remove a moment ago, that was just indicating to us where we last fed, which was down the center of the bin here. However, even though we saw quite a turnout last time for all that mix of veggie scraps that they got 2 feedings ago, I'm not sure of, what type of turnout to expect down in here in response to their last feeding, which was just coffee and a banana peel. But you know what? I sort of skipped a step that I really want to try to incorporate into the beginning portions of every one of my worm bin check-ins nowadays, which is just a little treatment of this, it's water basically, but it's water treated with that mosquito dunks solution. So if you have a pond or if you have property where there's any sort of standing water, perhaps you already know what this stuff is. Basically, this stuff prevents mosquitoes from being able to establish a colony of, colony basically. But it does have other types of insects that can be controlled with this mosquito dunk solution, and that's the trade name or the brand name. I believe there's like a bacteria which is abbreviated as BTI. So I sometimes just refer to this as my BTI solution versus calling it mosquito dunks. And I've been trying to make it the new regimen to spray down all of my systems lately with this stuff to try to make it impossible for the fruit flies. Those are the target insect in this case. Make it impossible for the fruit flies to propagate their next generation. Because this stuff ain't going to kill any fruit flies outright. It's going to actually prevent the development of their next generation. So they'll be able to, lay their eggs. Those eggs will hatch. But it's the larva, the insect larval state is where those insects will kind of come to an end. They'll be unable to transform into a fly. And then that next generation capable of mating and continuing on will be stopped there. And I've had good luck with this stuff in the past, both outside in the pond, controlling mosquitoes, but then also down in here in the wormery, controlling flying insects. So I'll often check the feeding zone of my bins to see if I could fish out leftovers. And this here looks to me like possibly the leftover stem of the banana peel they got last time. However, banana peel is a pretty common feeding in my worm bins, so that stem could actually date back to a point in time further than the last feeding. I don't know for certain. If we find another banana stem that's far more intact, then that might actually be the stem associated to the last feeding, or it might be this one here. It's hard to say. So yeah, we do have a pretty good turnout down in the feeding area. We've only excavated half the feeding area. We've already got ourselves quite a mob of worms hanging out. Even more over on this side. Wow, look at that. Oh, goodness me. So some of these other food scraps that we've been fishing out of the feeding area. Here's another piece of banana peel. So they've not eaten all of the banana peel they got last time, which is fine. They'll continue working it down. It's not going to prevent us from using this opportunity to do away with our coffee and our additional banana peel that they're getting today. So like we do sometimes, we're going to let these worms that we pulled out of the feeding area sort of relax, burrow down into the bedding, and then we'll jump back in here momentarily to give them their feeding and to press on with getting the next bin fed too. Lots of baby worms in here, look at them. Somehow baby worms always seem to stick to a glove. So now, this bin is, as I mentioned earlier, over 6 months old now. And if you were to start a brand new worm bin, it wouldn't just consist of you taking all of your coffee and banana peels and apple cores and whatever and throwing it all in a bin. Perhaps even more important than the foods that the worms get is the bedding that you provide for them. So what you see here is just some shredded paper and cardboard. I even mixed in some leaves. So with every feeding, it's customary to include some bedding. And that's what I'm putting in here now. Just a little something to help build out the bin a little bit further. And you can already see bedding pretty much everywhere. Scraps of the shredded paper that I've used in previous feedings. So that's what that stuff is, and all the stuff mixed in between, all the dark material everywhere else, are the worm castings themselves. So let's begin reloading some of these food scraps from feedings gone by, getting them back in here before we forget about them. So the banana peel and the banana stem In addition to these couple chunks of corn cob, here's half of a corn cob. Here's another corn cob that's not yet been broken too much, except it's just half of a cob, really. And then other parts of the corn cob down here that you bumped into is this round piece where I actually took an actual corn cob and sliced it into little discs. You really don't need to go too out of your way, because regardless of what you do, your worms will gladly eat everything. But one thing that I do sometimes, in fact most of the time, is I freeze most of the foods that are going to the worms. The coffee I don't. However, the banana peels did come out of my freezer, and it does seem to help a lot, because when something's been frozen and then it thaws, as you might have seen in your, kitchen exploits, if you spend any time in the kitchen, when you take something out of the freezer, depending on what it is, I suppose, it could get pretty mushy. And that's kind of what you're looking for. You want to help the material kind of get to that easy to eat stage. And by freezing and letting stuff thaw, the stuff definitely becomes much easier for the worms to break down. And then another thing besides the bedding and the foods is a little bit of grit. The grit could be rock dust, it could be sand. In my case, it's pulverized eggshell, and it's just stuff to really help the worms break down the foods that you're feeding them. And then the other thing that I'm sprinkling in here as sort of the topping ingredient is just it's kind of a generic expression. Everyone calls it just their worm chow, but everyone mixes up their worm chow differently depending on what they just found in their cupboard. Any sort of dry materials that need to be done away with. I pulverize birdseed. I've got a box of old pancake mix and whatever else. Anything else that I've got laying around that needs to be done away with, that's kind of a dry material that can be easily ground up, always becomes my ingredients for my worm chow. In fact, I've even got a nice collection of pumpkin seeds piling up here. These are going to be making up my next batch of worm chow. And as you can see, my next batch of worm chow is going to get whipped up pretty soon, because I'm almost out of this batch. So this bin is doing really nicely. In the past, I used to consider 6 months as being very old for a worm bin in my wormery. But more and more I've been striving to run my bins for quite a bit longer anymore. And, at this point, the fact that I've got a bin that's in excess of 200 days of age is perfectly normal. In fact, I've got other bins that I'm, already beyond the 300-day mark. So let's get this bin here covered back up. Like I said earlier, this coffee filter that you see here, it's simply showing us where we last fed, right down here in the middle. And then I'm protecting the moisture content of the system from evaporating and turning the system into a dry, barren wasteland by keeping plastic on it. Sometimes in the summer, plastic's not needed because there's less evaporation going on, more humid weather. In the winter, though, I find keeping plastic on helps a lot to protect against excess drying and evaporation. So let's get the other bin out here and get them fed too. Now, with both of these bins having the same launch date and being the same age, you can imagine I've been managing them as a tandem pair since day one. And sometimes even my tandem pairs that were launched on the same day show signs of differences depending on various things. But luckily, I think we can count on these systems being very similar to each other. And for that reason, there's a little bit less exploration. It's more just sort of rinse and repeat approach. However, the little goof-ups I made on bin number 1, I get to recover on. So, like I said earlier, I've been trying to apply this stuff in the beginning. And the reason for applying it in the very beginning is because my target for this stuff, my target for the mosquito dunks for the BTI solution, are gnats and fruit flies. And I've definitely seen a couple here and there. Luckily, their numbers are still somewhat limited. So I'm attempting to sort of nip the situation in the bud, if you will. And I assume that if there are any fruit flies trying to make themselves at home in this system, they're going to be in the top very thin layer of the material in the bin. And that's the reason I think applying the stuff right in the beginning before you sort of stir everything up, that's the best time to get the stuff in here, because that's where your target audience for this stuff is. So evidently we had some paper towel placed in here, which has, I don't know, shown very little sign of breakdown. So I guess, you know, I don't always go over, like bend over backwards, if you will, to try to maintain consistency in my bins. I'm just trying to do away with household stuff. So even though both bins got coffee and a banana peel last time, perhaps I had just a piece of paper towel laying around that needed to be composted, and that's how that ended up in here. And who knows, maybe this bin is just a little bit slower than the other system. Maybe there was another paper towel and it was added to the other system and they actually ate it, and here maybe they just haven't gotten around to it yet. I don't know. There's no guarantee for consistency when you're managing your worm bins, but I believe we will probably bump into a few things where we can draw parallels to the other systems, such as a chunk of banana peel right there. And here's another piece of it. Now I would have to guess that those are probably parts of the peel that were fed during our last check-in a week ago. The other stuff that was put in here, though, the coffee, I would imagine is probably nowhere to be seen. Now this thin little thing, it's probably no thicker than my index finger. I'm pretty certain that this is a piece of, yeah, it is, piece of corn cob. It's just interesting to see how a piece of corn cob that's probably about this thick when you start out ends up that small. I guess that's probably partially because they nibble out the center, the inner core of the corn cob pretty soon after you've given it to them. It's one of the softer, juicier parts of the corn cob. But the rest of the material that stuff is made up out of, the corn cob, is very tough and fibrous and takes a lot longer to get eaten by the worms. So I just imagine that they're just sort of working their way through it, and since the inner portion of it was already sort of vacated and eaten, they somehow the material just sort of collapses inwards on itself, since the inner core of it is already gone from the very start, or practically gone from the very beginning. It takes a little while. They don't get the core out 1, 2, 3. It does take them a little bit. Corn cobs are a slow composting food item in your worm bins. And it does seem to me like we're sort of at a slightly, I don't know, slightly higher level or slightly greater quantity of material in this bin than we saw in the other bin, because I do like to open up these feeding areas to give me room to plop in the food, but it does seem to me like I'm a little bit more constrained on space here. And here too, we've got a good number of worms hanging out. Like we did before, I'm going to give them a moment or two just to retreat into the bedding, and then we'll get back in here with their feeding, and then we'll be finished. But we don't want to have any worms dropping off my glove onto the floor, so I'll always take care and make sure they're all off my glove before I take my eyes off it. All right, let's give these guys a moment or two. Alright, so like we did before, we're going to grab a handful of my prepared bedding for them, and on top of that, before we start piling in the old and the new foods, I think we're going to begin by trying to put this piece of paper towel into a spot where it's almost guaranteed to get a good bit of worm traffic right here below the foods that we're going to be giving them. Perhaps it was spared because it was resting on top of the feeding or something. I don't know why, but I figured, you know, since it shows hardly any signs of wear, let's see if we can help it along a little bit. And let's see, we found a few banana peels, we found a couple chunks of corn cob, but not a whole lot of anything else. Sometimes I even bump into things that I'm unable to identify, such as this thing, whatever this was. I know that I added pastries, some sort of a interesting pastry that just wasn't all that good. So it just ended up becoming worm bin food, and it could just be leftovers of that. So let's see here. Last time we put the coffee in first and then the banana peel. We can alter that order a little bit since I already just reached over and grabbed the banana peel. I'm not going to put it down to try to abide to some sort of strict order. We can certainly alter things slightly here and there if we want, but I do find that there might be a little bit of a benefit to maintaining consistency between my worm bins. Perhaps if for no other reason, because it might help with troubleshooting someday. If I can go at some sort of troubleshooting effort with the knowledge that I've been maintaining these bins to the best of my ability in a very consistent way, then it just might be easier to nail down whatever inconsistency it is that might be causing the trouble. Or on the flip side, I might be trying to track down the cause of some sort of windfall or benefit that I'm observing. So who knows? It's also just interesting to have a point of comparison for, being able to compare and contrast two systems that are the same age, probably have the same number of worms living in them. Although here too, just like I mentioned earlier, this system does somehow appear to have a far greater quantity of material in it for whatever reason. And offhand, I just don't remember why. There's probably a good reason for it. And who knows, maybe in a future check-in we could even try to account for that by maybe going really generous on bedding in the first bin when we feed it, and maybe a little bit less generous on the second bin when we feed it next time. But unless I make myself some sort of a note, there's no chance of me remembering that. There's just too much going on down here with all those bins, and it's not that important either. So that was fun. We've only got a few things left here to do, which pretty much just consists of covering up and putting away, and naturally cleaning up. But I'm going to spare you that because that's boring. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.